Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast. We are Jeff and Tara Matson, a husband and wife team who is shrinking the integrity gap in our own lives and helping others do the same. I'm a leadership and organizational development coach, and Tara is a licensed marriage and family therapist.
We believe that if you have a following, you are a leader, and how you lead matters. Whether you are leading in the home, work, or community, we are bringing you biblical, clinical, and relational wisdom to help you in every relationship that matters most to you. None of us do this perfectly, but we are leaning into the reality of our humanity and profound wisdom of grace. So we are back to part 2 of talking about abuse in the church and trying to bring hope in the darkness. If you haven't listened to the last episode, make sure you listen to that first before you dive into this conversation. We are picking back up with Pastor Joel Harris and his wife, Kimberly Harris, who is a writer and a blogger, and specifically is written with magazines like Christianity Today on topics about abuse in the church. I would love to continue as we unpack more, Joel and Kimmy, about how you went through your journey of healing. First of all, talk about the moments of when you first think, oh my goodness, I've got abuse in my own story and I need to address that. What's that like? And what did you do at that moment to move forward?
I think that that's an interesting question for me to look back at, because it actually makes me recognize how much I've grown and changed since then. I think, like I alluded to in the last episode, I think that when I first really was willing to recognize and name the abuse, I was very uninformed. I had very little resources for understanding my own story, let alone the dynamics I was seeing and the chaos I was really seeing fall all around me with other people's stories. And so I think what I immediately knew was that I needed to have different voices to help me navigate some of that. So one of the resources that you mentioned was, I think, one of the very first things I read, Mending the Soul. And that was so helpful to me just because there's a lot of information in there. And I remember I just devoured that book. I probably read the whole thing in a couple of days. And it was because I was so hungry for trying to understand not only what happened to me, but also why everything was happening around me. And that is also a helpful book for understanding the dynamics that happen around abuse, not just with the abuser, but also with community response. And so I think I learned a lot through that book. And that was one of the early resources for me that really helped me understand not only my personal story, but also why it was that communities and different churches respond in the way that they do. So I think that that was probably one of the first things that I understood and realized was that I didn't have resources, and I absolutely needed them because I knew so little.
And maybe I would just jump in and say, I'm sure when you first were realizing some of your own story and we started talking about that, my own knowledge or understanding was very, very limited. And so, I think certainly I just tried to be supportive and tell you that didn't affect your value or your worth or, the way that I viewed you. But at the same time, I also probably wasn't really going to understand or have a concept for quite some time of just how much there was going to be a journey of really having to heal and to see the ways that it had affected you and impacted you and sometimes just the cost of dealing with that story and making certain decisions or standing up for certain things. So yeah, we, in a lot of ways, probably neither of us really knew all that was going to be ahead.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, I think that's so fair. And it's probably really common, if not 100% the case, is that we don't really know exactly how it goes. It's like telling someone, who's never had given birth to a child what that's like. And you don't really know until, or someone telling someone about having a teenager, and you don't really know fully until you have a teenager. And so the journey of healing from abuse is really hard to describe for people until you've gone through it. And as a spouse or support network around somebody, I love, Joel, that you're speaking to that there was things for you to learn too and to grow through. And that is true. That is true for every survivor, and is a gift when there are a few people willing to grow and to learn along the way. Talk a little bit more about kind of the community messages in the church, and maybe not yours specifically, but maybe you've been around the church for a while. What are the things that we end up saying that hinder survivors from getting help? Maybe think about your own story, Kimmy. What would have told you, don't do this, you don't need to go here? And then maybe what messages helped you move towards your journey of healing?
Well, I think that some of the messages that I think are really common, not just in my story, but in other people's stories. Now, in some of my writing, I've been given the opportunity to interview different victims who had really, really difficult abuse situations that they were trying to walk through, often in the context of a church community. And so I see the same dynamics in their stories as well. But I think one message is an oversimplification of the healing process that can be really harmful to victims who are basically told that if they forgive, that then everything will be all right in their story. And I think that oversimplification ignores a lot of other dynamics, such as community response to an abuser and the biblical call to desire justice as well. But the other thing that happens is that victims can truly forgive, but there's still a lot of hurt and harm that abuse has produced in that person's life. And so the healing process isn't simple. And I think that's important for leaders to understand. And it's also important to acknowledge here that there are many people in ministry who are abuse survivors as well. I know that is true for so many of different people I've interacted with in ministry. Many of them either had experienced abuse themselves or were married to somebody who experienced abuse. So they're in that category as well. But then also for people who do have that in their past, to understand that it's okay, that it's not easy and simple to heal from abuse, because abuse does have a big impact. And then I think that the other thing that's really important to understand is that boundaries are okay. I think that sometimes, along with an oversimplification of forgiveness, there is this idea that once you've forgiven, then no boundaries. You can't have boundaries with people who are abuser or who support abusers. And I think that has produced a lot of harm for different people, including, like I said, for different people that I've interviewed, and recognizing that sometimes they were kept in abusive situations because they thought forgiveness was the only step that they needed to take. And that perpetuated abuse for sometimes many years. And so I think that understanding that boundaries can be part of a godly life, and that also creating boundaries that keep people safe is both for the sake of abusers, that actually serves them, and it also helps protect the vulnerable as well. So I think that those are some of the things that come to the forefront when I think of some of the things that initially are said to victims when they come forward. And then I kind of already mentioned this, but I think that it's also just really important to talk about the healing power of the truth. And I think that there's a culture both in the secular world as well as the Christian that thinks we can heal by ignoring our pain. And so I think that really healing starts with recognizing the pain of our own story and being willing to name that. And it's only then that we can start addressing it and having the healing power of God's grace in our lives. Because if we don't recognize and see the impact that abuse has had on us, if we are always ignoring those, then I think it's hard for us to see the truth of God's healing power for those things as well. So I think starting with recognizing and being willing to speak the truth to our own story is really important. And that may, for some people, also may include recognizing the truth of the impact of the failure of others to support you coming forward as a victim, because that is definitely a big part of many people's stories, including mine, where that was an added pain and something that I also had to recognize and name before I could heal.
It's a very common piece to survivors coming forward and then being re-abused in a system where they're told that if they just forgive, as if it's not got the rectification of it all would just land on that. But forgiveness and reconciliation are two different things. And so I appreciate you pointing to boundaries and safety, and the abuse needs to be stopped first. It's kind of how we do assessment work in the counseling world, is before we can move towards the treatment and the healing of all the undercurrent pain, there does need to be very clear sense of boundaries and safety, whatever the abuse is. And so I appreciate you speaking to that. And that is sometimes just because church leaders just don't know. They just don't know. And the other half is because they haven't addressed their own abuse and are doing the ignoring. Hence, it leads us to ignore other people's pain as well. And so the only way we can really tune in and walk with people in the trenches of their pain is if we're willing to do it ourselves. So I appreciate both those points. Joel, is there anything you wanted to add as you think about messages that help people towards healing or hinder healing?
Sure. Yeah, I think on the side of what's important for just the broader church community, as well as certainly leaders and pastors in particular, I think it's important just to really be willing to listen, try to allow space as as a survivor is wanting or is comfortable sharing their story, like allow them to share and listen to that, to be slow to speak, as it says in the book of James. And we've already talked kind of just about the theme of humility, not trying to feel like we have to come in and have all the answers or pull a Bible verse out of the air and just try to kind of slap it on there like a Band-Aid. But yeah, be willing to listen, be willing to really be patient. Again, is kind of already been mentioned. The healing process is going to be often certain aspects of it are going to take a lot of time or be just difficult. And so being patient with that, allowing a survivor also the time and the opportunity to really grieve what's happened and be able to name that and acknowledge that, and both in terms of abuse that's been perpetrated and maybe in terms of community response that's also been harmful, but letting that happen and be kind of recognized and grieved, and the chance to lament. I think that's something that God's word really gives us a lot of examples and even helpful prayers or songs in the Psalms of lament. And it's something that we, I think, as a kind of the Western church or the American church, are not very comfortable with and don't really see the value of. And so we tend to kind of skip over those or not really grapple with them as much. But I think certainly when it comes to real pain that comes through the whole issue of abuse, the need to be able to lament and allow people to do that and do it with them. I mean, of course, the Bible teaches us that we're to weep with those who weep. So all those things I think are really important for us as brothers and sisters and as leaders. Negative things that are unhelpful, certainly lies that can be told, lies that can be believed, is just that a victim that they don't really matter, or at least kind of it's communicated through actions or responses that they don't matter as much as a perpetrator, or that somehow they're not valuable, they're not precious in God's eyes. So that's a lie. Other unhelpful voices, it would just be any kind of minimizing of abuse, wanting to silence victims and just not have them rock the boat, not have them cause other people, to have to deal with the fallout and so on. Certainly a demand that just someone should forgive these kinds of really serious and criminal, in many cases, criminal offenses, and just never bring it up again. Like Kimmy said, an oversimplification. Those voices, those kinds of things can be really overwhelming and loud voices in our culture and even in our community. And so I think that's really where it's on us, even if we're not a person who's directly or personally dealt with abuse, it's on us as a community and as the church just to make sure that those aren't the voices that are the loudest, that they're not kind of winning the day, but that the truth is brought to bear, that the truth is spoken and the truth is applied.
So good. And I would love to just maybe end our conversation with a little bit of the practical. Let's maybe help those who are maybe not the survivor or victim, but somebody who is coming to your pastor and there's someone who's saying, help. What would you two recommend, or some next steps or things that we could do better? Give them some tips, then I'll add to that and we'll close up.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that one of the first things that comes to mind is for victims, knowing that obviously we've shared some of the hard things about lack of support, but part of the healing journey for us, which is really important for everybody, is if you realize that you have abuse in your own story, that you find people who will support you. Not that they necessarily know everything about abuse or what healing is going to look like for you, but that they could be a warm, supportive, listening ear that isn't going to judge you or make oversimplified advice. I think that support really is important because God did make us for community, which is why when there's a community failure over issues like this, it's so painful. But on the other side, when you have supportive people in your life, that can make all of the difference. And so I think that even though that may take time, I think that it's important to say that there are people out there who absolutely will be supportive, loving, healing people in your life. And so I think that that's important. And then if you're a ministry leader, I think it's really important that you also find like-minded people to address this issue together with. And I think that that's something that has been so good for us as a couple. Joel working with the lead pastor here, who is also just so open to learning and making the hard choices when situations come up to do the right thing. I think that that's also really important if you're in ministry, recognizing that this is something that you need to have community support to really be able to address effectively. And so that's been important for us to, on the ministry side, being able to link arms with people who care about this issue and want to do the right thing and are willing also to learn and grow in this area along with us. So community support, and then also I think recognizing the need for trauma-informed counseling is really important as well. I think that one of the things that happens in churches is that sometimes ministry leaders feel like they have to be the sole person giving input into that victim's life, and it's really important that both the victims and ministry leaders understand that this can be a team effort, that you can be support and speak truth to that victim that is healing and helpful, and that victim can also be receiving help from a mental health care provider, a doctor. Often victims have different health concerns, either related to their health or just the impact of trauma on their life, and recognize that they don't have to be all of those things, that they can be part of the team that brings healing to that victim. And also for that victim to know that victim can get help from in different avenues. And so my story is a lot broader than just this topic. There's been a lot of other hard, difficult things we've walked through, including the loss of a child. So we as a couple have had to walk through those things, and that's had an impact on my healing journey. And I think it's important for people to recognize all of their story as both the good things that had a good impact and the bad things that had a bad impact. But for me, it absolutely involved getting medical care for chronic illnesses I have that I do think were made worse because of the stress of some of the suffering I went through. It meant getting mental health care for myself to recover from trauma. And it also meant looking at the spiritual side as well, and really grappling with the Bible and becoming friends with those who also cared about this topic and were deeply rooted in God's word, and were able to also provide more, a broader view of the riches of God's word to this issue. And that was such a healing and important thing. So I think that that's also so important for victims to know that there are those resources available out there. And even if they can see where there's not support, just to know that there is support out there, and that with patience and time that they will find that. And there's a lot of hope in that.
So good. Thank you so much. Joel, as we're ending, would you be willing to leave us with just a couple hope-filled principles that you both have learned in this journey? Because those are so practical. Thank you, Kimmy. And those are all just beautifully said. As we remind people of the hard place of abuse, even in the church, what hope can we leave them with that you two have learned throughout this last many years?
Yeah, I think it would probably be, for me, one of the things that I alluded to earlier, just certainly, Jesus is the good shepherd, and both when he talks about that in the Gospels, and then there's in the Old Testament prophets, that same theme comes up, that Jesus is kind of taking on that mantle of the good shepherd that God uses to describe himself. There can be those who are doing harm, and those who are wolves and who are seeking to hurt, and then there's also those who maybe shirk their responsibilities and what they really are supposed to be doing to protect God's people. And yet Jesus is that good shepherd, and there is a lot of comfort and just a lot of assurance in that. And then as we seek to be aligned with him and to have his heart and reflect his character, just knowing that he's with us in that, and that if we're there in the trenches and with Jesus is there with us, then that's just a really good place to be, even though sometimes it is going to involve, taking up our cross, and it is going to involve maybe uncomfortable situations or having people who really misunderstand or get upset with us. But just knowing that he's with us, and that his heart is for the vulnerable and those who have been hurt, and those who need protection and who need relief. So that's certainly a big thing, I think, for me, that I think about. And then just knowing that God promises that he's going to complete the good work that he's begun in us. And certainly, I think major things that can happen in our lives, such as abuse, there can be other things as well. Kimmy mentioned, loss and other kinds of suffering, can really shake us. And maybe, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical, health problems, or whether it's, mostly just, spiritual and kind of emotional stress, can kind of come in and cause us to feel doubts, or just cause our faith to seem very at risk or very vulnerable. And so I think just understanding that ultimately it's Jesus that holds on to us, and that he will not let any of his sheep be lost, and that he is going to finish the work he's begun. At the end of the day, it's kind of what I have to hope in, and what I want to be calling people back to. It certainly can't depend on our own strength or our own ability to kind of hold firm, but ultimately it's his faithfulness. And so those are certainly two big things that I really lean on.
Great word to end with, because it speaks to all the heart in life, as you guys have been through a lot. And in your many years together, you've leaned further into the arms of God. And I love that you're reminding that the good shepherd won't let you go. He won't let his sheep go, even if we want to let him go at times. And I just hope who's ever listening right now, whether you are a survivor, to know and to let Kimmy and Joel's story be of hope to you, to know that you're not broken goods, that there is so much that God uses in turning our ashes into beauty, and uses our pain and the things that we've learned in our suffering and through our healing journey to really go to places with other people in ways that we can't otherwise. And if you're a leader, as both Kimmy and Joel are speaking to, you got to do your own work. It's the place that gives us eyes and compassion, and it helps us to not compartmentalize. I'll end with this. The number one thing that I see in my office with leaders is the dismissing. It's a cue. It's a siren that says, "Oh, I haven't done my work." When we dismiss our own pain, we're dismissing the pain of those we lead, those in our family. And when we can validate our own pain and go, "Wow, what happened to me and what I went through, that was horrible. That was hard." Yes, somebody else had something harder. That's always the case. But it's still a place where you have to weep and to face the truth, as Kimmy was saying. The truth will set us free. So to be able to go there and to do that kind of work makes you a shepherd that will get down and look someone in the eye and see them right where they are. And to know that this takes time. And it's not fast, though we like it fast. It's not fast. And so to just be encouraged, go to livingwholehearted.com for more resources, or we can help you find resources wherever you're at in the world. And if you want to reach out to Joel or Kimmy and learn more about their writing and the things that they're doing, how can they find you, Kimmy?
You can find me on Instagram. I think my Instagram tag is kimmy.n.harris. And then also I do have a website that I will be updating soon with some of my newer articles, but you can see on there a list of most of the articles that I've written on the topic of abuse, as well as suffering. There's a list of those on that website. And so that's kimmyharris.com. So you can find some of my writing or links to my writing there. So those are the two best places probably to find me.
Well, thank you to both of you. And we'll put both of your handles down in the show notes so that people can find you. Thank you so much for sharing your story and for helping others to maybe put to words some of the things they're experiencing and helping them in their healing journey. So it's been an honor to sit with you and to just be able to sit underneath both your feet and listen to where God has had you and where you are today. Thank you again. And I'm so excited to be able to tell you more about our book, Shrinking the Integrity Gap Between What Leaders Preach and Live. It is speaking specifically to the leaders who haven't resolved their own story. And Kimmy alluded to it earlier, that it's really common for those who are lead, whether in the church or in the marketplace, to have unresolved trauma. And there's a lot of reasons why that is. So get that book or get Steve Tracy's book, Mending the Soul, start learning. And Kimmy I'll have her send me a few of her resources and Joel's resources, and we'll put those in the show notes as well. We're offering Mending the Soul recovery groups on an ongoing basis at Living Wholehearted. We do trauma-informed counseling. Our executive coaches are trauma-informed. So know that if we are willing to help you find a referral in your area, that's what we're looking for, is trauma-informed resources. And we would be willing to help you if we can. Thank you so much, Joel and Kimmy, and blessings to all that you're doing out there in South Dakota.
Thank you.
This podcast is powered by Living Wholehearted, Courageous Girls, and the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Thank you for joining us in this critical movement of shrinking our integrity gaps between what we preach and live.